World Series is well in the rearview mirror. It's time to finally look ahead to the next baseball season. And that starts with the leadoff spot in your fantasy drafts. Who should be the number one pick? And for some of you, this might sound obvious. You know who you would take if you got the 1.1, but it might not be as simple as you think. You know, the big appeal with this year's World Series, it wasn't just that it was the two biggest market teams, New York and LA, old franchises, rivalries, and all that. It was the two biggest stars in the game with Shohei Ohtani and Aaron Judge going head to head. We know who got the best of that battle. Is it going to be the same thing for fantasy next year? Is Shohei Ohtani the no doubt number one pick? Well, let's dig into it. Now, of course, if you had Shohei Ohtani last year, you had a good chance of winning your fantasy league. But Shohei Ohtani wasn't the number one pick last year. Let's keep that in mind. It was so obvious that Ronald Acuna Jr. was last year's number one pick. There was no way you were taking anybody else. He set records, the 40-70 club. He invented that. If you had Ronald Acuna Jr. last year, you were very disappointed. Now, I understand that injury was a big part of it, but it's easy to forget that way before he got injured, he was just struggling. Acuna had racked up 222 plate appearances before getting hurt. He was only hitting 250 with a total of 4 home runs. There's no way he would deliver any kind of return on investment from the number one overall pick. So just because you think you know who should be number one is not always the guy who should have been. But let's start with the obvious candidate. That's Shohei Ohtani. Well, he makes the strongest case. Clearly, he invented a thing. It's called the 50-50 club. That's right, 50 home runs and 59 stolen bases almost made it a 50-60 club. And then there's the fact that he hit 310, 130 RBIs, and he also scored 134 runs. He carried you in basically every single category offensively for fantasy. And if you're in a points league, yeah, forget it. He carried you even more. Check out those percentile rankings on his Savant page. It is impossible to really have any better of a season than Ohtani had last year. And really, if there was anything surprising here, it's the fact that he actually led the league in plate appearances, 731. If there was a concern last year why he wasn't drafted even higher, it's because, well, that elbow, which prevented him from pitching it all last year, maybe it wouldn't hold up offensively, even just as a hitter, even just as a DH. You just never know. This is a guy who isn't necessarily in his prime as far as age anymore. He is 30 years old. He's now had repeated serious injuries, so there's always that risk. And obviously it didn't matter. But really the big surprise was actually the stolen base total, because we know he's got speed, he's willing to steal, but he had never stolen more than 20 in a season for the majors, at least. He only had 11 steals in 2022 and then 20 in the 23 season, and then all of a sudden up to 59. Yeah, honestly, we knew that being in that Dodgers lineup would help his offensive context, but did not imagine he would get the green light this often and steal this many bases. So that's what really made him a league winner. So he's still in that Dodgers lineup. He's still the best power, speed, hitting, everything threat in baseball. Why would he not be number one? What are their concerns? Okay, so if we're going to find something, here's what it might be. We saw him slow down in the postseason. Sure, you have tougher competition in pitching, but still, this has not mattered all season for Shohei Ohtani. He did hit only 230 in the postseason. And the World Series, only 105, hit 2 for 19, not a single home run. And so we're finding out later is that maybe he wasn't completely healthy to end the season, but then this goes back to the main concern with Ohtani. Is he going to break down? Maybe too many plate appearances during the regular season wore on him. Maybe this long postseason is going to wear on him heading into next season. You would hate to speculate on any kind of like Acuna situation where everybody's in on him. You're expecting another record-setting year, and then he's out midway through the season. But you also don't want to necessarily hedge against that because you're going to pass on massive upside just trying to predict an injury. And honestly, that's a mistake that I almost made with the next player I'm going to talk about. There is definitely injury risk with Ohtani. I think everybody knows that. But at the same time, you can't draft based on fear. So with that said, would it be a better idea with the number one pick to take Aaron Judge? So I'll admit it, last year, I wasn't crazy about taking Aaron Judge early in the first round because of his injury history. We had seen a monster season from him, but we'd also seen some seasons cut short. And this is a guy with his frame. You never know when those injuries could happen. It didn't happen last year. 2 years after crushing 62 homers in a season, He almost did the same, went for 58 last year. And despite fewer home runs, he went for more RBIs this past season, 144 of them. And also 122 runs scored and a 322 average. That's right, Aaron Judge hit for average even better than Shohei Ohtani. So now that side-by-side comparison with Ohtani and Judge, you got Judge with more homers, more RBIs, a higher batting average. The only category where Ohtani is ahead and noticeably is those stolen bases. And that's because Judge did stay healthy and also racked up over 700 plate appearances. But just like Ohtani, he also slumped when all eyes were on him the most, and that would be the postseason. He hit just 184 in the playoffs last year. And in the World Series, he did have that one home run, but that's it. Otherwise, also disappointing. Had 7 strikeouts and only 4 hits. And like Ohtani, Judge, now age 32. Look, this matters less for a slugger, and especially we're talking about a player who doesn't rely on his speed necessarily. And while Judge did technically get double-digit steals, just barely, he's not really going to help you much in that category. You compare, again, Ohtani and Judge from a statistical standpoint, your typical 5x5 roto leagues, it's a close call. Do you take the big edge in stolen bases for Ohtani and compare that with everything else that Judge has to offer? You're more worried about Ohtani because of his recent injuries as opposed to Judge wearing down? Does the prospect of pitching every 6th day maybe wear Ohtani down even more? Well, before I give you my answer, let's throw in a dark horse candidate. Look, it's probably going to be Ohtani and Judge in the vast majority of fantasy leagues, but could you take Bobby Witt Jr. at the number 1 spot? Look at what he put together last season. A higher average than both Ohtani and Judge at 332, 32 homers, 31 stolen bases, 125 runs scored, and also a guy who's out there every single day, 709 plate appearances. And the difference with Witt is he is not even in his prime, a very young player, and in his first 3 seasons, he's gotten at least 632 plate appearances each time. He's just become even more of an Iron Man, and so you don't have maybe as much risk as you do with the first 2. And it's also now worth mentioning, with Ohtani, you've got to use up that utility spot, and clearly that's not an obstacle if you have Ohtani in there. You don't really care who you're not starting in the utility spot. But Witt gives you third base or shortstop eligibility, whereas Judge outfield and Ohtani DH only. So that might be a little bit more appealing when you're making up the rest of your roster. That's not to say there is no downside with Witt. Now, the first thing is, look, he's not on the Dodgers or the Yankees. The Royals, sure, were pretty impressive last year, making the postseason. This is a growing offense here with a lot of young players. It's not the stacked Dodgers lineup. And also, realistically, I don't think he's got 50 home run upside. I'm not sure he ever will. And so while 30-30 is nice, and remember the year before, he went 30 and 49. He could maybe hit 50 steals one year, but the power is capped compared to the other 2. And here's the thing, too, as far as the steals, sure, there's upside for more stolen bases, but he actually ran less last year because he's been caught stealing quite a bit. Last year, Witt swiped 31 bases but was caught 12 times. The year before, when he stole 49, he was caught 15 times. So maybe not getting the green light as often as Ohtani will. Is it crazy to consider a pitcher, maybe a guy like Paul Skeens at the number 1 pick? Yeah, it kind of is. Look, we know the risk here. Pitchers were overall a little more reliable than usual last year, even some guys that were injury prone, but then there's the Spencer Striders, and we know how that went. And before anybody mentions Ellie De La Cruz, look, I get it. He is now in the 25-65 club, if that's a thing. He is not the first and won't be the last guy to hit that. Maybe he goes for 80 steals this year. Look, that wouldn't surprise me. But again, the power is somewhat limited compared to those Ohtanis and the Judges. So I'm not going to take the downturn in batting average and RBIs just for a few more steals. So if you have the number 1 overall pick in your fantasy baseball draft this coming season, who should you take? It's Ohtani. And what it comes down to is simply the fact that the guy is not human. All right, that's not a great argument. Oh, look, Ohtani has now jumped up to the 50-50 club, even if the stolen bases get cut in half, which wouldn't be surprising. Even if the plate appearances take a downtake, it's still going to be a guy who delivers on all fronts, and the power is not going away. Maybe a better question for early fantasy baseball drafters is, do you want the number 1 pick, or are you better off taking a later pick? But that's a question for another video. And we will have plenty more. Just getting ready to dive into the numbers for the 2025 fantasy season. So hit the subscribe button. Check back into Fantasy Endgame Baseball for all your draft needs.